things. And now I would like to welcome Nicole Töpperwien, who will present the session this morning. I will shortly introduce her. She's a lawyer and has a PhD in law. She has worked or researched a long time at the Institute for Federalism in Fribourg. She has founded, more or less recently, I believe, her own company, which you see there, Impulse. And she does mainly consulting on constitutional matters. So she's an expert in constitutional affairs. She works a lot for the Political Division 4 at the Swiss Foreign Department. That's the division working on human security. And she has particular experience in Macedonia and also Nepal, where she's working currently. So welcome, Nicole, and thanks a lot for coming and for giving this session.
Well, thanks a lot. We are now third day into the program, or even the fourth day into the program, but the third day with morning sessions. Workshops were running already in the evening. I hope I won't bore those from my own workshop by, of course, taking up certain issues that were already discussed, but I will promise them I try to keep those overlaps limited and put the focus a little bit broader than what we do also in the workshop. Perhaps just because otherwise I will forget it, I put 3 publications at the back of the room. 2 of them are just general introductions to Switzerland, as you get them free of charge if you visit the parliament and so on, just if someone is interested. And the other one is one that I prepared with a colleague on power sharing, the Swiss experience. And as this connects to power sharing, I thought I'd bring it along. There are also some copies in the back. And more or less, the question mark behind was, can you export Swiss power sharing, if I may put it like this? And of course, one gets a little bit a squeezy feeling. And this was a little bit the answer, by trying to point to context and to the challenges that are connected with it, but using it as an opportunity to explain the Swiss system, because in quite a lot of cases, when you are in conflict situations, one party or the other asks, well, you've got experiences in a multicultural country, how do you do it? So we reinterpreted it, but in this way of just more or less trying to explain the Swiss power sharing system. Today, I decided for perhaps a little bit a dangerous undertaking from my point of view, by putting the topic on the 4 stages from armed conflict to functioning power sharing. Why is it dangerous from my point of view? Because I'm working as an expert, as pointed out. And as you will see later on how I define the stages are pretty much different blocks in the process, let's say from conflict to hopefully peace. And why did I get so much interested in looking at stages and looking at the process? Because I noticed that as an expert, if I don't take the process into account, if I'm not very much aware where we are in the process, and if I don't have at least some understanding what is happening in the process, I cannot give a meaningful input. And I think also this presentation, to some extent, is my attempt to understand part of the process, and also to see what is a role an expert can play in such a process. And I was thinking that this perhaps here is, for myself, an ideal place to do, because I'm sure that we've got experts of various areas in this room on power sharing, but also especially on process. And therefore, I think it's also the time to challenge each other and to enter into a discussion. I personally like to talk, but I'm very much happier if you stop me from talking. So at any time, feel free to interrupt and to so that we have more a debate than anything else. Well, the topic of the overall course is political means of conflict transformation. And then, of course, from my point of view, working on power sharing, it is very obvious that there would be a part on power sharing. Because in a way, in many cases, people think, at least they think, they might be mistaken in certain cases, that power sharing is a means for conflict transformation, is a mean how you can cope with conflict and establish, let's say, some peaceful avenues to react to conflict, to work with conflict, perhaps to get out of conflict. When we look, there is also a specific perspective. If we look at conflicts nowadays that there are, and when I'm talking about conflicts now, I talk about armed conflicts, violent armed conflicts, then we notice that most of them are intra-state conflicts. They are, of course, international conflicts. You also have intra-state conflicts with quite a strong external factor to it. But still, when you look at it, the majority is intra-state conflicts. And also, more than the majority, again, of these conflicts are conflicts about power also, and conflicts about territory. Who will rule over territory? Also, who will rule over people? Who will rule over resources? And with that, then, power sharing seems to be the evident step, the evident response. And also, if we look at experiences, at this moment, we see that quite a lot of conflict parties are only willing to talk about peace, to take the risk of going towards peace, if they're assured that the peace will bring also a share of power, or that there are, at least one party normally demands, that there are debates on power sharing in there. And this would also bring me to the very pragmatic answer, where you can avoid a little bit whether power sharing is good or bad, to saying whether we like it or not. I think most likely it will come up. If you've got an armed conflict, most likely the debate on power sharing will come up. So in a way or the other, it has to be dealt with, no matter what we think about power sharing, unless one party is really able to overwhelm the other party and therefore find its own solution. So with that then, it's perhaps often not so much the question whether to introduce power sharing, but how to introduce it and what kind of power sharing. When I talk of stages, what kind of stages am I thinking of? And they, especially for process orientation, I think they are a little bit basic perhaps, but as they are just more or less on a time span. But for me as an expert, I think it is important to see in what stage it is, and I experience very specific challenges in these different stages. First of all, I think one of the big challenges, if you are in an armed conflict, to come to a point where the different sides agree that there is a need for power sharing. Because for quite a long time, at least one party will not agree to it and will not be open to discussions on it. And then afterwards, once there is this agreement that the need for power sharing is there, then it would come the phase where you have to decide on power sharing. So it's more or less then normally the negotiation phase. And then afterwards, when you have got an agreement or a new constitution, it will have to be implemented. And there are specific challenges during the time of implementation. And I would even argue it's power sharing sometimes. There are not only challenges with agreeing on it, implementing on it, but also afterwards living power sharing is not always such an evident situation. Just to put it in differently, during the talks about talks, where you talk about whether you shall have a peace process, already there normal power sharing comes up. But during negotiations, of course, it has a major part, saying, okay, now, what kind of power sharing? Or do we debate about it now or later? Do we debate about everything now or everything later? The negotiation part is also that part that we most specifically look at during the workshop. And then there is this period of implementation transition. And there I would say the implementation period is quite often the post-agreement period. But I wouldn't say yet that it's post-conflict, because many of the problems are still there. The conflict is not completely overcome. Only when the institutions start working slowly, perhaps you can say, and there is a certain amount of stability, and other reforms are being done at the same time, you can slowly start off perhaps also a post-conflict situation. We had other presentations already during this week, and we had more or less a mapping of the conflict studies. I think this is in a way a basis, is the understanding for conflict. We had one example, a resource conflict. I will be a bit broader, I will not limit it to resources, but to the matter of power in general. We had pre-negotiations with a focus on intra-group negotiations, and I think in my presentation this will come up again and again, because I think it's such an important aspect, and I think there a debate could be especially fruitful also, because sometimes it's very difficult to persuade, let's say, also international community to engage in this intra-group negotiations in armed conflicts, especially when rebel groups are concerned. We've got the psychosocial dimension, and I think this is only coming now, but those of you who are in the workshop already know more, and I think if you leave out the psychosocial dimension, at least latest during implementation, but probably also during negotiations, we will not be successful. Andy Gross took one measure of power sharing, direct democracy. I, of course, also there will be broader, but will not go into detail with many power sharing mechanisms. Quickly, perhaps as a start, and I won't go so far into it, is the question, what is power sharing? And I think we can take quite an easy definition here, though I'm aware that there are quite specific definitions of power sharing also. But what is interesting here, I think, is not so much to categorize, now is this power sharing, is this power division, and so on, but just to look at the philosophy that is behind most of these mechanisms. And that is that not just a dominant group should be able to decide everything, that it's not enough to have 50% plus one to rule over a country, but that you have to find other mechanisms that provide for that, in a way you share power between representatives, whether this is of groups, of regions, of political parties, and so on. And normally, and I also don't want to go into detail there too much, we distinguish between vertical and horizontal power sharing. And this is to say, in vertical power sharing, Andy Gross mentioned direct democracy as vertical power sharing. You have those who govern, and you've got the people, and in a way, or you have got the parliament and the government and the people, and through direct democracy they have to share power. Also, if you take decentralization, certain aspects of federalism, you've got vertical power sharing. The center cannot decide about everything, but on certain issues the regions can decide, or different groups can decide, and therefore you've got vertical power sharing. But you can also have horizontal power sharing, and this we find very frequently also wherever we look. Whether this is that you prescribe that the government is composed of a coalition, or whether you have got, for instance, a rotating presidency where once one of the majority, once of the minority has the function of a president, or whether you've got in parliament specific voters to ensure representation, specific procedures to ensure that on important issues nobody can be overruled. These are examples of horizontal power sharing, where you, within one level of state, of government, you share power between different groups. And one major difference perhaps also that one always has to keep into mind is how is power shared? And then you've got two major approaches. You can provide power based on, let's say, group identity. You share power between groups and say, okay, this ethnic groups will always have 3 seats in the government or 3 ministerial posts. Or you can make it on a regional basis or territorial basis by saying, okay, one territorial unit will always have 1 post in the government, something like this. Just to show that all of these mechanisms, again, you can make based on a philosophy of giving power to a territory or giving power to groups. So during this presentation, I will go less into the details of these different power sharing mechanisms, but we'll focus on the different stages and what challenges they are coming out of a logic of power sharing during these stages, and that in a way also have to be overcome or have to be tackled in order in the end to come up with a working system of power sharing. Now I'm coming to the first phase, and that would be the agreeing on the need for power sharing. And here, please feel free to interrupt at any time with comments, with questions, whatever there is. If you agree, if you don't agree, feel free to change this from a presentation into a discussion. And another thing, this is being filmed. But if you want to bring in certain particular cases where you think this should not end up on YouTube or wherever it might end up on the internet, then just show a break and we'll go to Chatham House rules where we will discuss, but where it will not be said, this person said this and that, so that we can have an open discussion. And depending what questions will come, I will use the same right to do so, and then it will be cut out of the tape, if we come to it. So I had already mentioned in the beginning that a lot of the conflicts are about who rules over the people, the territory, the resources. And the reasons, and that it's normally a power struggle, and then at least one party challenges the current power situation that is in place at in a certain area. Of course, for the other side, it is not always easy to accept that this power structure is challenged, that there is a need perhaps to change certain things. And there are clashing interests that come together. Whatever is the motivation for asking for more power, whether we can say, yes, this motivation we can support or we cannot support, is a matter aside. I think this is a different matter. But we see that these challenges to power arise. And of course, it's also now always a simplification as we are dealing with so many different contexts. But when are normally people willing to enter into peace negotiations? And this is when, out of whatever reasons, the situation becomes unbearable, and it's a mutually hurting stalemate, in a way, and negotiations start to promise a better alternative to continue war. And this is, of course, always the question, when is the case that negotiations is a better alternative? And perhaps also what can outside actors do to encourage that it becomes a better alternative to negotiate than to try to reach what you want to reach on the battlefield. And there, I think it also reminded me a bit what Jay Rothman was saying with the antagonism, when he mentioned the example of the couple where they fought so long, even though only in this, let's say, secure space, that at one point they said, no, now we would like to try something else. And in a way, this also has to be reached in international, or in conflicts, in armed conflicts. But what this also says is that, please.
I have a question. One of the points is existing power structures
Yeah. Perhaps this is then we have to be careful with the formulation leading to use of violent means, we could say in a neutral sense. Because quite often, of course, it's then also afterwards rebel group against security forces, or even, as you mentioned in this case, which case are you thinking of? Say Zimbabwe, where then you've got very harsh reactions to what you could say are more or less peaceful protests. And I think this is also, but I'm not saying that this is in Zimbabwe the case, but one of the difficult issues, I think, is if you want to have attention to a conflict or so on, in a way, sometimes I would say also those who want to have change provoke violence to some extent. But it's a question whether the state reacts to it, no? Because a certain degree of violence, in a way, delegitimizes then the government. But this I think is one of those difficult issues. But of course one has to be a lot more nuanced than what appears out of this sentence here. But what comes out of it, if we have an engagement in peace negotiations because it seems as the better alternative, then as soon as something changes, for instance on the battlefield, or something changes within internal dynamics, perhaps the willingness to engage in peace talks will vanish, will evaporate again. And I think this is also the challenge, how to keep the parties engaged, especially also because every time that peace talks fail, it will be more difficult again to establish it, as the trust that's already not there, even the little bits that perhaps have been established during pre-negotiations will, or during talks about the talks, will crumble again. This phase, I think, is also very important because normally during these talks about the talks, you establish quite a number of things. You establish, for instance, the agenda. And there you have then at least one party, perhaps, that says, we will only come to the table as power sharing is included. So it's the question of the agenda setting. What will be discussed? And also, when will it be discussed? One debate is always, do we have to talk about cessation of hostilities first? Or can we perhaps first talk on power sharing, and with that establish a vision of the peaceful future? How we do it. But it's also normally a debate on how the process shall be structured. And I think this will also very strongly influence the focus that will be given in the peace negotiations, and afterwards also what you can debate, and I will show it later. But also who shall support the process. For instance, shall already be experts there or not? Yep.
I have a question regarding the parties that are invited. So how are the different parties or groups identified?
Mm-hmm.
You have like obvious conflict lines, but then you find out that actually something totally different, and maybe other groups are on the two sides of the conflict. So
Yeah.
which tool of conflict analysis do you use to identify the right groups?
The tool. I wouldn't say, well, it's normally a bigger process, or I myself will not identify this, just to say, but for the tools, I would not have one specific tools to use. The one debate is always, and we will come to it later, is how big should it be to make it, or you've got two different, let's say, you have got a paradox. On the one hand, you want to keep it small, because that makes it easier to negotiate. On the other hand, you need a certain number of stakeholders, and you try to include at least everyone who obviously could spoil the process later on. So it would be an analysis also who has the power to spoil in a way. But in a third aspect, you would want a certain legitimacy of the outcomes. And then you can ask, if you are too exclusive, again, what will it do on the legitimacy of the outcome, especially when you include power sharing mechanisms that might be in place for a longer time in the future. And I think this is this is one of the challenges, and we will come to it, where especially when you start negotiating about power sharing, a lot of people put a question mark. Well, then also say, okay, perhaps we have to make two groups of negotiations, a smaller group and a bigger group that on certain issues at least get involved. But from my reading is of course always the question, whom are you able to get to the table? Not everyone might be able to join in. Are those that you are able to get at the table important enough? Represent important enough groups? And who would be able to spoil your process? And those you will try either to bring directly at the table or to include them in some other ways. In a way then afterwards, for structuring the debate, what you saw in several cases now was that you had like different committees that to some extent worked relatively independent on power sharing, wealth sharing and security, for instance. And they're just to say that, for instance, if you take apart power sharing and wealth sharing, so this is especially the case if you've got huge natural resources and this is a problem. These issues are after all interlinked. So if you have, for instance, if you introduce autonomy into a certain area, they will also be interested how much control will they have over the resources or how much will they profit about the resources. A structure will in a way already try to separate something that is not separated, but you don't have other ways to dealing with it because they are technical. But the challenge is then how to have enough interaction between committees that you can after all build compromises. As an expert on power sharing, what are the typical things one is asked to do? And I think from where I so far was engaged, and I am young, so it wasn't so many cases, but it was some after all. It was mainly with parties separately. This is the phase where they're still thinking whether they want to engage in a process. So they want to find out for themselves whether they think that power sharing can bring an answer to their problems and can be an alternative to the battlefield. So then it is normally one-to-one talks with one group to explore a bit the issue of power sharing, and also for them the possibility to find out in how far it can be useful. But of course another role is also perhaps for structuring the debates, but we can come later on it. I would now already come to the next step, negotiating power sharing. Please.
Is transitional justice an issue at all in this stage? When you talk about power sharing?
It depends probably on the case. There is also, I think, transitional challenge is one of those cases where you've got those who are directly involved in conflict are normally quite happy to leave it out. But where you've got other groups, whether it's civil society or victim groups or so on, who want to have it in. And this is also where, for instance, it is argued quite well that at least on these issues of transitional justice, you cannot have it decided among the leaders only and the former conflict parties only. But this is one of the cases where you have to open it up to have the debate more inclusive. Nowadays, of course, debate is also changing a little bit with the International Court